Our next speaker is Linda Ray Feng. Linda was born in Shanghai and lived on the west and east coast of the United States before moving to Toronto, where she is a professor of Chinese cultural history at the University of Toronto. Feng holds a BA in Earth and Planetary Sciences from Harvard University and both an MA and PhD in East Asian languages and cultures from Columbia University. In addition to academic writing, Feng writes fiction and poetry. And I will say that I've known Chet Van Duzer, her significant other, for quite some time, and we had them over for dinner not long ago, and I got to meet Linda and heard what she is interested in and working on, and so I'm delighted to have her here today.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you for the wonderful invitation. And of course, I've known the David Rumsey Center for many years as a resource, but it's a privilege to actually present here and then to show my slides on the screen that's basically bigger than my office. So in this talk, I'm going to do three things. The first thing, I'm going to highlight two aspects of East Asian maps and the general characteristics. And then I'm going to focus on a case study specifically about how the Yellow River source was depicted on maps. And then I'm going to step back from this case study and think about ways that we can learn what these variations in the different ways that the source of the Yellow River has been depicted can tell us about mapping, and especially about mapping the unknown or the partially known. So I'll start with some basic terms. So I've been saying map, but in Chinese or classical Chinese, map is, the term for map is tu, or it refers to maps as we think of them, but it also refers to a combination of pictures, painting, diagrams, and charts. And it also serves as in addition to it being a noun, it's also a verb, meaning to plan, to anticipate, give thoughts to, and to kind of fight for, to strive for. And of course, it can form compound terms with, terrestrial, celestial, complete, and so on. So it's a very versatile and capacious term. And again, I'm saying it's literary Chinese, but this is also the term used throughout East Asia. So for Korean and Japanese maps, this is also the case. And then, so in this way, in this capaciousness, we can think of the East Asian map or tool as not just chart, etc., but having vast kind of permeable boundaries with painting, with diagram, with illustration, with writing, and these are all really important aspects of mapping in East Asia. So I'll give an example, one example of a map that's also a narrative. So this is a map called Map of the Five Regions of India. This is a 14th century paper and ink map, manuscript map, found, it's kept in the Horyuji temple in Nara, Japan. And by the way, the next time you go in the stairwell leading up to the center, pay attention to a comparable map on the right side or left side, depending on which side. That's actually a later analog of this map. So this is a Buddhist cosmography. So it presents the world that is Buddhism envisions. It's an oval continent, at the center of which is this lake that gives rise to multiple rivers. But for our purposes, so here you can see the diagram showing more clearly the center with the swirling rivers that come out of the lake. And also you can see that Japan is actually off the map and China is at the very edge of the map. And of course, the center are the 5 regions of India. But what's relevant to our purpose here is that this map is also a narrative. So it's a narrative from the travel accounts of this Buddhist pilgrim from the Tang Dynasty, from the 7th century, Xuanzang, who made a famous pilgrimage from China to India and returned with a set of foundational translations that basically became the canons of Buddhism in China. And he documented his travels to the Western regions, meaning to India and back, in this a document called Records of the Western Regions. And if we look at the map and zoom in on, I know it's very hard to see the details here, but if we zoom in, you'll see that there's a red line that connects these white cartouches, which are place names. And these are the places that the pilgrim had passed through. And in between these cartouches are the texts that describes this, the journey between these places. So in a way, this map has encapsulated the entire narrative, the travel narrative of Xuanzang on his way to and from India. So very versatile tool, right? So the second example I want to give is a map that's also a painting. And so here, closer to home, this is found in the Met Museum. It's a almost 13-meter scroll depicting the course of the Yellow River. You can see from the bottom photograph that it's indeed very long. It takes time to walk from one end to another. And it's a scroll, and so it's color, it's on ink. But what's interesting for our purposes is that it is both on top, it's a top-down view of the course of the Yellow River. And at the bottom, what you see are these very kind of classical blue and green landscape paintings of mountains in profile. So we have these two simultaneous perspectives depicting the Yellow River on one scroll. And so this is another aspect of a tool or East Asian maps that's extremely interesting for our, and I want everyone to keep in mind. So now I'm going to start talking about this cartographic problem, which is how does the Yellow River begin? And of course, this is not a cartographic problem, really, initially. It was just a question that, that has been around for as long as people knew about the Yellow River. So today, to just some quick background, today we know that the Yellow River begins in a mountain in the Tibetan Plateau where other rivers originate. But details about the actual headwaters were still being debated late into the 20th century, and even with these modern surveys. And so the Yellow River's origin has again, this is, we have to go back in time a little bit. It's a particular interesting problem because even though the Yellow River, as many of you know, is a very iconic and important river to Chinese cultural history and to cultural identity, for most of its China's history, the origin of the river, or the headwaters, was actually outside the empire's borders. And of course, it's in the remote area, very difficult to access. So this also, not subject to human intervention or flood control, the way that the lower or middle reaches the river is very much, a part of. So it sort of creates this really interesting vacuum or interpretive space that on later maps, when we start to have surviving maps of the Yellow River headwaters, we see this question coming into contention. And so again, there is a long history of grappling with how does the Yellow River begin, starting with early mythopoetic texts, to sort of later but still early geographical texts about rivers in general. And then when we start to have a cartographic record, we can start looking at how map makers started to think about how to depict the origin of the Yellow River. So something in this long history, this is like millennia long history of grappling with the source, something really interesting happened in the 13th century, which is that the Mongols took over, and the Yuan dynasty, controlled by Mongols, at the very beginning of it, a group, well, Kublai Khan, decided to create a survey to actually go to the source of the Yellow River and check it out. So he commissioned this expedition with two brothers of Yurkin descent, and they actually went out there and identified this place name called Constellation Lake as the source of the river. This is not the first time that this has come into history, but this was the first time that people actually documented travel distances and very specific features in the headwaters. And also they explained the relationship between this so-called Constellation Lake with this mythical, not mythical, but this kind of a storied mountain called Mount Kunlun, which had earlier in myth, sort of foundation myth, been kind of identified as the origin of the Yellow River. So very interestingly, and unfortunately, no maps survived, or even records survived from that original 1280 expedition commissioned by Kublai Khan. What we have are text descriptions that came about 50 years later from a Chinese writer who documented, so everything I just told you is documented in this 1333 text. And then there was no maps associated with it until another 100 years later. And so again, we're getting sort of gradual accretion of image and text. But the map that did come about 100 years later is this block print, black and white diagram of the source of the Yellow River. And this is the sort of really the earliest true elaboration of how it begins. So north is, so it's actually south on top. So we have the Yellow River source beginning at the right and flowing to the left. So if you look at the feature, the red feature is the Constellation Lake, Xinxiuhai. And a green circle contains Mount Kunlun, which has been demoted, so to speak, downstream. So this is a very important map in terms of identifying some of these key places in the source of the Yellow River. And the way that the Constellation Lake was described is a very vast area. It's not a single point, it's a vast area full of these small pools of water, and it's very muddy. And the description actually says, when viewed from a mountain nearby, they sparkle like arrayed stars. And so after this depiction, so again, we're looking at a 1430s depiction over 100 years after the actual expedition. After this has come about, in the subsequent dynasty, which is the Ming dynasty, we see basically an explosion of representations of the Yellow River on different kinds of maps. And I'm talking about large format manuscript maps that are like 2 meters by 2 meters, printed maps, smaller maps in encyclopedia and gazetteers. And there's just all sorts of ways that people started to depict the headwaters of the Yellow River. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of them that are kind of categories. So these are shorthands in my mind of how they are depicted. So I'm going to start with the so-called necklace model. Again, this is my own shorthand. So for if we go to this gigantic map from very early in the Ming Dynasty, It's a 3 meter by 4 meter silk map. It's kept in the National Archives of China. And this is why I have a very bad image of it, because it's not actually possible to get a better digital image of this. But if we look at the source of the Yellow River, where the green arrow is, and we see some familiar details of the headwater. So we see the snow-capped Mount Kunlun, and we see this body of water that this is why I'm calling it the necklace model, because it looks like a string of pearls. And again, sorry for the low quality of this, but there are small circles interconnected. And then there are another set of representations that I'm calling the gourd model. So if we go to a map made in the 16th century, this is a printed map with the Yellow River colored in. And if we go to the source of the Yellow River, what we see is this shape of a gourd. And it's labeled Constellation Lake at the bottom, and then on top it's labeled Source of the Yellow River. And again, we see this kind of in other maps, so this is echoed in other examples. And so what can we learn from these varied representations? And I propose that one way we can think about them is to kind of see them in context with maps and encyclopedia and gazetteers that are much more available and widely circulated. And even though they're not as strikingly visually, they're not beautifully colored, they offer a greater context because they also have text and image coexisting in a given map, kind of like the way that what I just showed you with the pilgrimage map of the 5 Indias. So if we revisit the necklace model and looking at gazetteers, I can show you now a gazetteer from around the same time, 17th century. It's a gazetteer of Shanxi province, which is in north-central China, where the Yellow River passes through. And if we look at the source and how it's depicted, what we see is this another kind of string of pearls. But they're not in a circle, but they're kind of like branches, and they're hanging or kind of splayed. So if we look at them in conjunction and look at them, this and the early Ming Dynasty giant map that I just showed you, and look at ways that they're how they're using their visual vocabulary. So even though it's highly unlikely that the first influenced the second directly, what we do see is that they nonetheless share some kind of a common visual vocabulary. And so if we look at this star chart from the 7th century, what we see is that both of those images are in fact making a reference and making a visual elaboration on the idea of the constellation. And then now, if we revisit the gourd model in the same way, here we can look at this wonderful popular illustrated encyclopedia from the early 17th century. And it's something that a lot of people, literate people, had access to. And it's of this really voluminous source of everything under the sun. So if there is a map, there is a section in it, in the geography section, that depicts the origin of the Yellow River. And if we look at it, so on the right, this is the encyclopedia from the 17th century. On the left is the earliest map from based on the Mongol expedition. So we're looking at 1430s on the left and 1607 on the right. And you can see that the Ming Dynasty encyclopedia maker was clearly taking their images from the early Mongol map or Mongol-related map. And all the place names are very similar, almost identical. All the features are almost identical, except for the constellation lake itself. So on the left, you can see that what was labeled Constellation Lake was this kind of globular globe. And on the right, it is a different new shape now in the 17th century. And so from this lobe filled with small circles, we get the shape of a gourd. And so there's almost no mistake about what the map maker was trying to do or trying to tell the audience. So the question is, why gourd? This conscious substitution. So the gourd is a charismatic object associated with immortals and kind of like magic in Taoist lore. And it's sometimes described as containing worlds in miniature, including endless flow of water. And so in a way, we're looking at a map maker's attempt to connect the depiction from the Mongol expedition, which didn't really have this element, to existing cosmological models and motifs and concepts that an ordinary reader in the 17th century would have immediately understood what to do with. And so I've just kind of given you lots of details, lots of images, and now I want to take a step back and think about what does this all mean. So we can see that even by the late Ming Dynasty, the 17th century, there was not a cartographic consensus on how to depict the origin of the Yellow River. And again, we're talking about the different kinds of maps, different formats, large and small, black and white versus painted manuscripts. But what we do not see, and this is where I think is very, very interesting, is this linear progression. We do not see a teleological movement from earlier conceptions to kind of the new correct conception of what the Yellow River, how it began. What we do see, however, is this much more iterative back and forth between early conceptions that are cosmological, textural, geographical, and this input of new geographical knowledge, and kind of, again, not a linear, but like a more of an iterative process. And so what we see in this case is that the Yellow River source on maps was contingent, recursive, and very messy. And again, I haven't given you all the examples, but you get the idea. And so it deserves a particular kind of attention, especially to place names. And I haven't quite mentioned some of the place names in the Mongol map. They're actually transliterations from Mongol. So they're not actually Chinese, they're Chinese transliterations. So they're multilingual place names, and it's a multilingual map. So a lot of these place names, as well as the shapes of the origin, the headwater, might be used as kind of a tracer as we study East Asian maps in general, and then also the circulation of knowledge between different renditions of encyclopedia, of maps, etc. And stepping back even further, we often ask ourselves, what are maps? And here I want to ask the question, what do maps do? The historian Francesca Bray very famously put forth a definition of tu, or maps, as graphic images or layouts with encoded knowledge that were templates for action. And I really like this definition. And here I can say that kind of going on this definition, the Yellow River's headwaters really was an interpretive space that accommodated different modes of knowledge and also kind of imaginative extrapolations. And it's a good reminder for how maps are more than visualizations of geographical knowledge, but also makes inroads into the imaginative and kind of ways to reconcile with the partially known and the unknown. So thank you, and I welcome any comments or questions.